So in the previous lecture, we discussed what utility is, we defined it, and then we defined the four concepts related to utility. So we understand how to calculate total utility, marginal utility, diminishing marginal utility, and disutility. Now we want to use utility to understand why consumers purchase the goods that we do. We already know that it's our goal to maximize our total satisfaction. Therefore, if we did not have limited income and we can just purchase whatever we want whenever we want, we would simply just be looking at the amount of utility that we derive from consuming goods and services. So for example, let's say for an apple, I can see the different levels of marginal utility that I derive when I consume different quantities. So in other words, let's say for example, when I consume one apple, I get 50 utils. When I consume 2 apples, I get 40 utils, so on and so forth. And then I can do the same exact thing for, let's say, a pear. So I can look and see what my marginal utility would be for each individual pear that I would consume. So again, this first column of data is simply going to be the quantity. So again, let's say from that first pear, I say that first pear gives me 40 utils, and the second pear, let's say, only gives me 15 utils. So in other words, I can clearly see that I derive more satisfaction from consuming that first apple and that second apple opposed to the pear just by looking at the amount of satisfaction that each unit is giving me. However, we have limited income. We cannot just go out there and consume goods and services based on the amount of satisfaction they give us alone. So to really hammer this concept home, suppose I'm out shopping for a new car, and I'm just looking at just the utility that an item's going to give me. Well, I might go to the Ferrari dealership then, because if I'm looking at all of the different cars and trying to figure out which one will I get the most satisfaction out of driving, it's probably going to be a very expensive sports car. However, I don't actually have the capability of purchasing the Ferrari simply because I don't have enough income to support demand for that type of good. So when we are looking at how people actually consume goods and services, we are not just looking at the utility alone, but notice here at the bottom of the slide, I say we look at the price also. So we have to look at the marginal utility in relation to the price to know what we actually purchase. So let's add the prices in here. Let's say that an apple costs $2 and a pear only costs $1. So now in order to look at the marginal utility in relation to the price, I simply take the value of the marginal utility and divide it by that price so that I can see what is the utility that I'm going to get per dollar spent. So if apples are $2 and the marginal utility of the first apple gives me 50 utils, I would do 50 divided by 2. Therefore, the marginal utility divided by the price is 25. So I get 25 units of satisfaction for every dollar spent on an apple. And then I can do the same thing for the second apple. I said the second apple gives me 40 utils. 40 divided by 2 is 20. So in other words, eating a second apple would give me $20 per apple spent. And then I can do the same thing for pears. Pears are only $1, so 40 divided by 1 is 40. And 15 divided by 1 is 15. So I can see from eating that first pear, I'm going to get 40 utils per dollar spent, and from eating a second pear, I'm going to get $15 per util spent. So if I'm looking to see which item I would purchase first, I'm looking to see which item am I going to get the most satisfaction per dollar spent. Well, even though I actually like apples more, when I take price into consideration, I'm actually going to get more satisfaction from eating that first pear because the pear per dollar spent is going to give me 40 units of satisfaction, whereas the first apple is only going to give me 25. So again, my first purchase, my pen doesn't want to work today. would be the pear. Now, to see what my second purchase would be, I look to see how much that second pear would give me in terms of utility versus the first apple. So if I decide to eat a second pear, the second pear is going to give me 15 utils per dollar spent, whereas if I decide to switch gears and eat my next purchase be an apple, that first apple is going to give me 25 utils. So in other words, my second purchase would actually be an apple because I would get more satisfaction per dollar spent from eating an apple than I would eating a second pear. So my second purchase would then be an apple. So again, what we're always looking for is that we want to spend our limited income in a way that we maximize our total amount of satisfaction per dollar spent. So I'll walk you through another example that should be very easy to see since you're not having to read my sloppy writing. It will actually be on the slides. Let's say that your budget for the day is $10 for beverages. And suppose to keep it simple, we're going to say that there's only 3 beverages that you have to choose from throughout the day to purchase. You can either purchase a milk, a soda, or a beer. And then what you see I have listed here is the different price levels. Each milk is going to cost you $2, each soda is going to cost you $1, and each beer is going to cost you $3. But of course, in order to know what you're ultimately going to purchase, you need to know not just the price of the goods, but how much utility each one of those items is going to give you. In other words, how much do you actually like drinking milk, soda versus beer? So let's go on and look at that information. The first slide I have listed here is showing your utility or your marginal utility for milk. So that is your column of data right here. In other words, we can see the amount of utility that you're going to get from each unit of milk. So you'll see that if you have that first carton of milk, you'll get 200 units of satisfaction. The second carton of milk will give you 98, so on and so forth. So again, we see that diminishing marginal utility. As you drink more and more milk throughout the day, you're getting less and less satisfaction from drinking milk. But again, we don't want to just look at utility. We want to look at the utility you derive in relation to the price of that good. So what we actually want to look at is the second column of data where we take that marginal utility and divide it by the price. And you'll recall that we said the price of milk was $2. So we're going to take the marginal utility and divide it by $2. So 200 divided by 2 is 100. 98 divided by 2 is 49. 50 divided by 2 is 25. So that's how we're getting those numbers. So now we can see what the utility per dollar spent is on each carton of milk, so we know whether or not we're going to want to purchase milk in relation to the utility per dollar spent for the other 2 items we possibly may purchase. So on this slide, I actually have both the information for soda and beer. So again, if we're wanting to look at soda, that's going to be over here, this column of data. We have the marginal utility, and then we just simply have to divide that by the price of soda so that we can see what the utility is we're going to derive from each dollar spent on the soda. So again, that's when we want to look at this column of data right here. Now recall, soda was the cheapest beverage. It was only $1. So the numbers in our column for marginal utility divided by the price are actually identical to the figures in marginal utility column because we were just dividing by 1 each time. And then the third item that we could possibly purchase as our beverage would be beer. So that was over here. And then remember, beer was actually our most expensive item. Each beer was going to cost us $3, which is why the marginal utility per dollar spent is much lower because our denominator is a 3. So now that we've calculated the marginal utility per dollar spent for each item, now we can compare to figure out what our first purchase would be. So you'll recall that I said you had a budget of $10 for the day. And so right now we're figuring out how to spend that first dollar or first $2, $3, depending on what you're purchasing. So the first thing that we're looking at is the amount of utility per dollar spent each item would give us. So if we decided to purchase our first beer, we're going to look at the data right here that shows that that first beer would actually give us 50 units of satisfaction per dollar spent on the beer. If we decide to make our first purchase a carton of milk, we will derive 100 units of satisfaction from that carton of milk per dollar spent. And if we decide to make our first purchase a soda, we will get 200 units of satisfaction per dollar spent for that item. So again, the key here is we are trying to maximize the amount of satisfaction we're going to get with each dollar that we spend. So it's clear to see that our first purchase is going to be the soda. In other words, the soda is what is giving us the most amount of satisfaction when you take into account the price of the good. Okay, so we assume that we are going to go and we're going to make that first purchase, which is a soda. The soda was only $1. Therefore, we still have $9 left to spend throughout the day. And of course, we know, just like with any budget, we're going to continue to spend that money until it is gone. So the next step would be, as we get thirsty again, what is our second purchase going to be? So again, let's say that a few hours go by, we're thirsty again, we still have $9 left, we want to go make a second purchase. So again, we still haven't purchased any beer, so we're still looking at how much utility that first beer would give us. So the first beer was going to give us 50 utils per dollar spent. We haven't bought any milk yet, so we're looking to see how much would that first carton of milk give us. So let's say the first carton of milk gives us 100 utils per dollar spent. And then of course we already drank one soda today, so we're no longer looking at that data. We're now looking at the second row of data to see how much a second soda would give us in terms of satisfaction per dollar spent. So a second soda would give us 150. So if we were going to make our second purchase of the day, we can clearly see that we again are going to buy another soda, because the second soda is still giving us more utility per dollar spent than that first beer or that first milk. So we would make that second purchase, which is going to cost us another $1, and we would still have $8 left, as we see down here at the bottom of the slide. So let's say that we are now going to make a third purchase throughout the day. Again, we've already purchased this second soda, so I'm just going to go ahead and put a line through it just to identify that we've already purchased that. So if we are looking to see what our third purchase would be, we're still looking at that first beer, which gives us 50 utils. We're looking at that first milk, which gives us 100 utils per dollar spent. And now we are looking at a third soda, which would give us 50 utils per dollar spent. So at this point, our third purchase, we would now make a change, because a first milk would actually give us more utility per dollar spent than that third soda, because the third soda is only giving us 50. So if we're looking at our third purchase, that is now when we would switch to another product. So our third purchase would be milk, because it gives us 100 utils. And of course, after we purchase that, we cross that off, and we're no longer considering purchasing that either. So again, we had our budget of $8. A milk costs $2. So we subtract $2. We would still have $6 left to spend. And again, we would continue to spend until we have spent all of our money, going through that same exact process, identifying the amount of utility per dollar spent for each item, and then selecting the item that gives us the greatest amount of satisfaction. Now, as we continue to purchase our goods and services in this manner, at the end of the day, we will end up using our limited income to purchase goods and services that give us the greatest amount of utility possible. In other words, there's no other way we could have allocated our limited income to derive more satisfaction if we constantly purchase the goods that give us the greatest marginal utility per dollar spent. Now, of course, this step-by-step process that I just walked you through is extremely tedious. In other words, we know that in the real world, when you're walking down the aisle shopping, you're not calculating utils and dividing it by the price. However, you are going through this process in your head probably without even realizing it. In other words, you're looking at the items that you're possibly thinking about buying, and of course, you're only thinking about buying goods that you like, that are going to give you satisfaction. And then the second step is you're looking at how much those items cost, so that you're making a decision where you feel that you're going to get the most amount of satisfaction from the purchase of that good. So again, although we don't actually go through this tedious utils divided by price in the real world, you do go through a process like that in your head without even consciously thinking about it. Now, another thing that happens when we purchase goods and services in this manner is it pushes us towards this concept that economists refer to as consumer equilibrium. It's also sometimes called the equimarginal principle. And basically, consumer equilibrium is just stating that consumers must allocate their limited incomes in such a way that the marginal utility per dollar obtained from the last unit consumed are equal among goods and services. In other words, once you reach your consumer equilibrium, you have no incentive to reallocate your income in any other manner. So if we had gone through and done the math step by step for all of the purchases that we would make throughout the day for milk, soda, and beer until our $10 budget was spent, we see we ultimately would have purchased 2 milks, 3 sodas, and 1 beer. So that would be how we would be able to spend our whole $10 and get the most amount of satisfaction. And at the same time, we would have reached our consumer equilibrium. In other words, going back to this slide showing what we would have ultimately purchased, it said we would have ultimately purchased 1 beer, 2 milks, and 3 sodas. Right? So the marginal utility per dollar spent for that 1 beer is 50. The marginal utility we would have per dollar spent we would have received for the second milk was 49, and the marginal utility per dollar spent for that third soda would have been 50. So notice how they're all roughly equal to each other. In other words, there's no other way we could have allocated our limited income to derive more utility. In other words, if we had decided not to buy the second milk and buy a fourth soda instead, notice that we only get 30 utils per dollar spent for that fourth soda opposed to the 49 for the second milk. Therefore, we would have actually caused our total satisfaction to go down. So in other words, that's what we're trying to emphasize here when we talk about a consumer pushing themselves towards that concept of consumer equilibrium, is that if you constantly purchase goods where you're maximizing the marginal utility per dollar spent, there's no other way you could have allocated your limited income to derive more satisfaction.